In October of 1812, somewhere on the frozen roads between Moscow and Smolensk, the most powerful military commander in the Western world was doing something that no historian of his campaigns had ever been required to record before. He was waiting, not the tactical patience of a general holding his position for strategic advantage, not the calculated stillness of a man who has identified the right moment and is preparing to exploit it, but the waiting of a man who has run out of options and has not yet allowed himself to understand this. His officers had stopped presenting him with formal assessments. They had moved past the language of strategy and into something more uncomfortable, more personal, almost pleading in its tone. They were asking him to see what was already plainly visible. The army was dissolving. The winter had arrived weeks ahead of expectation. The supply lines that had been strained since June had now collapsed entirely. The horses were dying faster than the men, and Russia, enormous and indifferent, stretched in every direction without offering the decisive engagement that Napoleon had built his entire campaign around producing. He refused to acknowledge any of it in the terms his officers used. This was not, as it might superficially appear, a commander clinging to a rational hope in the face of adverse conditions. It was something more psychologically specific than that, and more dangerous. Napoleon had constructed his entire identity, his sense of self, his authority, his place in history, around a single governing belief that superior will, applied with sufficient force and speed, could overcome any material obstacle. This belief had not been fabricated from arrogance alone. It had been confirmed repeatedly over more than 15 years of extraordinary military success. Austria had crumbled before it. Prussia had crumbled before it. The coalitions of the major European powers had assembled and dissolved and reassembled and dissolved again, each time leaving Napoleon with more territory, more authority, more confirmation that his way of seeing the world was not merely effective, but fundamentally correct. What Russia represented, therefore, was not simply a military problem. It was an epistemological threat. If the campaign failed on its own terms, it would not merely be a defeat. It would mean that the logic which had governed everything, the logic that had made him Napoleon, was no longer sufficient, and that possibility was one he was constitutionally incapable of entertaining. To understand why the Russian campaign unraveled in the specific way it did, it is necessary to return to the beginning of the invasion. Not the military beginning in June of 1812, when the Grande Armée crossed the Niemen River, but the psychological beginning the moment the assumptions underlying the campaign were formed. Napoleon had invaded Russia with approximately 600,000 men, the largest assembled land force in European history up to that point, and with a plan that was in its essential architecture the same plan he had used to defeat every major European power over the preceding decade. The plan required speed, overwhelming numerical superiority in the decisive engagement, and a psychologically vulnerable enemy who would be broken by a single catastrophic battlefield defeat and compelled to sue for peace before the political and economic costs of continued resistance became acceptable. The plan had worked because, until Russia, the enemies Napoleon faced had been willing to fight it on his terms. They had concentrated their forces, met him on ground that allowed the kind of massive frontal engagements his tactical genius was designed to exploit, and had subsequently collapsed with a rapidity that surprised even him. Russia did not do this. The Russian commanders, Barclay de Tolly in the opening months, and then Kutuzov after Smolensk, understood what Napoleon needed from them and systematically refused to provide it. They retreated, burning as they went, destroying food stores and bridges and supply depots, pulling the French army deeper and deeper into a country so vast that the distances themselves became a weapon. Napoleon's force, which had entered Russia in June, numbering 600,000, had lost nearly a third of that number before a single major engagement through disease, desertion, and the sheer physical attrition of marching through an empty, scorched landscape that offered nothing to sustain an army of that size. And Napoleon, watching this happen around him, continued to believe that one more advance would produce the confrontation he needed, that somewhere ahead of him the Russian army would finally stop and allow itself to be destroyed in the manner he had prepared for. This is where the first and most consequential error of the campaign was made, and it was not a military error in any conventional sense. It was the error of a man who is committed so completely to a particular interpretation of reality that he continues to apply it even as the evidence against it accumulates in front of him. Every week of eastward advance that failed to produce the decisive engagement was information. It was Russia telling Napoleon, clearly and at enormous cost to both sides, that the war being fought was not the war he had come to fight. The rational response to this information was to revise the plan to consider that forcing Russia into a confrontation might require a fundamentally different approach, or to recognize that the approach itself was producing diminishing returns faster than it was producing military results. Napoleon, who in other contexts had demonstrated a capacity for tactical flexibility that bordered on genius, could not make this adjustment, because making it would have required him to begin from a premise he had no psychological access to. The premise that he might be wrong about something central. Borodino, in September of 1812, was the battle Napoleon had been pursuing for 2 months. Kutuzov had finally stopped retreating, digging in on a low series of ridges and ravines approximately 70 miles west of Moscow. And the two armies met on September 7th in 7 hours of fighting that produced casualties on a scale that shocked even veterans of the Italian and German campaigns. When the smoke cleared, Napoleon held the field and Kutuzov withdrew in reasonable order, and the French army marched on Moscow essentially unopposed. Napoleon recorded it as a victory, and by the narrowest technical definition of that term, it was. But it was a victory that contained within it everything necessary for the catastrophe that followed, because what Borodino had demonstrated for anyone willing to read it honestly was that the Russian army had absorbed a direct assault from the full weight of the Grande Armée and had not broken. It had retreated, but it had retreated as a functioning military force with discipline and cohesion and the intention of continuing to fight. This was precisely what Napoleon's strategic logic had required it not to do. The plan required annihilation, the complete psychological and physical destruction of the enemy's will to resist, and Borodino had produced nothing of the kind. Kutuzov had simply traded space for time and blood, which is what Russia, with its inexhaustible geography and its willingness to sacrifice cities, had been doing since June. Moscow, when the French army entered it on September 14th, was empty. The governor Rostopchin had evacuated the civilian population and given orders for the city to be burned before the French could occupy it and extract from it the symbolic value that Napoleon needed: the surrender of the old capital, the capitulation of Russian pride, the image of defeat that would compel Alexander to negotiate. Instead, Napoleon rode into a city of silence and, within hours, of fire. The conflagration burned for 5 days and destroyed 3/4 of one of the largest cities in Europe, and Napoleon, watching it from the Kremlin, sent his first peace letter to Tsar Alexander. He waited for a response that did not come. He sent another letter. He waited again. He remained in Moscow for 5 weeks, conducting the occupation of a ruined city from which the population had fled, waiting for a diplomatic outcome that Alexander had already privately decided would never materialize. The Tsar understood something that Napoleon could not yet accept, that the longer Napoleon stayed in Moscow, the weaker he became. Every week in the burned capital brought the French army closer to winter, eroded its already failing supply situation further, and gave the Russian military more time to consolidate and reinforce. Alexander had no incentive to negotiate. He had every incentive to wait, and so he did. The 5 weeks Napoleon spent in Moscow constitute one of the most psychologically revealing episodes in the history of military command. The decision to remain was not irrational in the sense of being arbitrary or impulsive. Napoleon had reasons, and they were not contemptible reasons, for believing that occupation of the Russian capital might still produce the political result the campaign required. But the quality that made those 5 weeks so destructive was not the decision itself, it was the refusal, during those 5 weeks, to engage seriously with the alternative. Every day that passed without a response from Alexander was a day in which the military and logistical situation deteriorated in ways that would make a November retreat exponentially more dangerous than a September retreat would have been. Napoleon's generals could perform this calculation. They performed it repeatedly and presented it to him in terms that grew increasingly urgent as October approached. Napoleon listened and continued to wait. What he was waiting for was not, at this point, realistically a peace treaty. What he was waiting for was permission. permission from external circumstances to make the retreat that his own judgment had already told him was necessary, but which his ego had made psychologically unavailable as a self-initiated choice. If Alexander had sent a delegation and Napoleon had accepted terms and withdrawn, it would have looked like a negotiated exit. Not victory, but not naked failure. If Russia simply refused to acknowledge him and Winter forced him out, it would look like something else entirely, and that something else was what he spent 5 weeks trying to avoid confronting. He left Moscow on October 19th. The decision, when it finally came, was not a strategic recalibration. It was a capitulation to arithmetic that had been obvious for weeks, made later than any rational assessment of the situation would have recommended, at a point when the window for a minimally viable retreat had already significantly narrowed. The army that departed Moscow numbered approximately 100,000 men in fighting condition, a fraction of the force that had crossed the Niemen 4 months earlier, and it moved westward into weather that had already dropped below freezing, and would become within weeks among the most brutal European winters in recorded memory. The roads it needed were contested. The supplies it required had been destroyed. The Cossack cavalry that harassed its flanks and rear was not fighting for territory, but for time, slowing the retreat to give the cold more opportunity to do its work. What happened to the Grande Armée during the retreat from Moscow has been described accurately as one of the greatest military disasters in history. But the description can obscure the specific nature of what made it a disaster, which was not primarily the winter, severe as it was, and not primarily the Russian military pressure, sustained as it was. The primary mechanism of the collapse was the cumulative effect of every delayed decision, every refused acknowledgement of reality, every moment in which Napoleon had chosen the protection of his self-image over the cold requirements of the situation. Each of those choices had a cost, and the retreat is where the invoice arrived. Men who would have survived a September withdrawal died in November blizzards. Horses that might have carried the artillery to safety in October froze solid on the roadside in December. The bridges over the Berezina River, which the army crossed under fire in late November at a cost of thousands of lives, would not have been necessary at all if the retreat had begun when the generals first requested it, when the river would have been accessible by multiple routes and the army would have had the strength to protect its own crossing. The disaster was not imposed entirely from outside. It was co-authored, in significant part, by the refusal to see clearly at the moment when seeing clearly was still useful. By the time Napoleon crossed back into Polish territory in December, fewer than 100,000 of the original 600,000 men remained under arms, and many of those were unfit for further service. The French emperor made his way to Paris and gave speeches and commissioned new recruitment drives and framed the Russian campaign in terms that attributed its failure to the peculiarities of the Russian winter and the logistical impossibility of supplying a modern army across such vast distances. These explanations were not entirely false, but they were incomplete in a way that was, for Napoleon, characteristic. They located the cause of the collapse entirely in external circumstances and nowhere at all in the pattern of decision-making that had turned a difficult situation into a catastrophic one. And because he could not locate that pattern, name it, he could not correct for it. Within 2 years, the coalition of European powers that had watched Russia absorb the Grande Armée and watched Napoleon refuse to adapt to what he was seeing had assembled the force necessary to end his reign entirely. They had identified in the Russian campaign something more valuable to them than a military victory over France. They had identified the specific contour of Napoleon's psychological limitation. They knew now that he would press forward past the point of return. They knew that he would sacrifice the achievable in pursuit of the total. They knew that, given the choice between accepting a diminished outcome and refusing to accept any outcome at all, he would refuse. And they built their strategy around that knowledge. There is a pattern in the Russian campaign that is not confined to military history, and it is not confined to men of Napoleon's particular temperament or historical position. The pattern is visible in any domain where human beings invest significantly in a particular course of action, attach their sense of identity to its success, and then encounter the specific kind of failure that demands not simply a new tactic, but a fundamental revision of the approach itself. The investment creates a psychological debt that makes clear-sighted assessment of the situation progressively more difficult as the failure deepens, because clear-sighted assessment would require acknowledging not merely that the current strategy is not working, but that the confidence with which it was pursued was itself a form of blindness. This acknowledgement is experienced by the ego, not as information, but as threat. And so the mind that most needs to revise its understanding is precisely the mind that is most motivated to resist revision, because revision, in this context, feels structurally identical to self-annihilation. The practical consequence of this pattern is that the second phase of a failure is almost always more destructive than the first, because the second phase is driven not by the original strategic miscalculation, but by the emotional and psychological responses to that miscalculation, responses that are specifically designed to obscure rather than illuminate the actual situation. Napoleon did not lose more men in the retreat than in the advance, because the retreat was inherently more dangerous than the advance. He lost more men in the retreat because every decision made during and after the occupation of Moscow was shaped, at its foundation, by the need to avoid acknowledging what the advance had already established. The retreat was not the consequence of a failed invasion. It was the consequence of the refusal to accept that the invasion had failed. These are not the same thing, and the difference between them is the difference between a difficult situation and a catastrophic one. When Napoleon finally left Russia and returned to Paris, one of his marshals, writing privately, described him as a man who had passed through something that had not yet fully registered in his expression or his bearing. He gave orders. He made plans. He spoke about the future with the same authority he had always used. But something had shifted in the quality of the certainty he projected, some almost imperceptible change in the distance between what he said and what he believed, as if the mechanism that had always produced his famous confidence was now producing a performance of it rather than the thing itself. This observation, if it is accurate, suggests something about the particular cost of Napoleon's pattern of decision-making that goes beyond the military and political disasters it produced. The cost was not only to the army, not only to France, not only to the hundreds of thousands of men who died in the Russian snow. There was also a cost to Napoleon himself, to whatever faculty of perception and judgment had once made him genuinely formidable, a faculty that depends in anyone on the willingness to see clearly, even when seeing clearly is the most difficult and unwelcome thing available. What Russia took from Napoleon was not, in the end, simply his army. Russia demonstrated in conditions from which there was no escape, and on a scale from which there was no recovery, that his method had a specific failure mode, that it could not tolerate situations that refused to resolve on his terms, and that when confronted with such situations, he would respond, not by adapting, but by escalating, not by accepting partial outcomes, but by pursuing total ones past the point where total outcomes remained available. Every man who enters a significant undertaking carries within him some version of this vulnerability, some place where the investment has grown large enough and the identity entangled enough that the honest assessment of a deteriorating situation becomes emotionally inaccessible. The question is not whether this vulnerability exists. It exists in everyone who has ever built anything, pursued anything, believed in anything with sufficient intensity. The question is whether at the moment the situation begins to turn the person as capable of doing the one thing the ego is most specifically designed to prevent, which is to see the situation as it actually is, rather than as it was supposed to be. Napoleon was not, and the retreat from Moscow is the record of what that inability cost. The first mistake, the invasion itself, was serious. It was the product of overconfidence and strategic miscalculation and the specific blindness that comes from too long a run of success. But it was survivable. Armies have invaded Russia and returned damaged but intact. The first mistake created a dangerous situation. What transformed that dangerous situation into a catastrophe was everything that came after it. The weeks of refusal in Moscow, the delayed retreat, the decisions made under the invisible pressure of ego preservation rather than military logic, the cascading consequences of choosing at every critical juncture the protection of a self-image over the acknowledgement of reality. The first mistake opened a wound. The second mistake, which was not a single decision, but a sustained pattern of avoidance, prevented the wound from being treated until infection had set in so deeply that no treatment remained available. There are letters Napoleon wrote to Alexander from Moscow that were never answered. He wrote them knowing at some level that they would not be answered, and he wrote them anyway because writing them was the last remaining action that preserved the appearance of agency, of a man still directing events rather than being consumed by them. Alexander, who received these letters and who chose not to respond to them, understood something that Napoleon had not yet accepted and perhaps never fully did. He understood that Napoleon had already lost not because of the winter, not because of the Cossacks, not because of the burned city, but because of the distance that had opened between what Napoleon needed to believe and what was actually true. That distance, once it opens beyond a certain width, does not close through effort or force or persistence. It closes only through the kind of honesty that Napoleon, standing in the ruins of Moscow with a pen in his hand and silence coming back at him from every direction, could not bring himself to practice.